Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, as we are just one day away from Power 5 college football on Thursday night, striking up the live stream for our big SEC preview 2018. And to jump on with me as co-analysts and hosts, we got Stephen M. Smith of Touchdown Alabama and Mike LaValle from Last Word on College Football. Gentlemen, how you doing tonight?
Fantastic. Always a pleasure to join you, Mark.
Absolutely. Good to see you guys as well.
Doing good, man. Excited, boy. This is the week right here.
This is it. We get started in some nice games in the SEC, and if we have any time at the back end, we will address week one. But I'm thinking we've got a whole bunch to talk about right here. So we know the narrative of best conference in the nation, undisputed for quite some time. In the past 2 or 3 years, it has been disputed. So, Mike, your thoughts about the conference standing among the Power 5 as we head toward 2018?
You know, I really think that there's an argument to be made that the Big Ten is the best conference. If you look at last year, obviously the Big Ten East has 4 teams will finish in the top, maybe top 15. You look at Ohio State, Michigan State, Michigan, and Penn State. Those are really 4 good teams, Big Ten East. But, hey, what the SEC has always prided itself on is being the best from 1 to 14. But when you look at the Big Ten, they're not far behind. If you look at last year, Indiana had a big win over Virginia with no out-of-conference losses. Maryland had that big win over Texas. Their only out-of-conference loss was to the only team that didn't lose a game last year, UCF. And Purdue beat Missouri in the regular season. The Big Ten went 7-1 in the bowl season. 1-1 against the SEC, but they went 3-0 in the New Year's 6 bowls. So the Big Ten, based on last year's performance, has a legitimate argument that they're the best conference in college football. I think the SEC is right there, 1 to 14. I think if you look at the upper quarter of the conference, I think the Big Ten gets that. I think if you look at maybe the 3rd quartile or the 4th quartile, I think the SEC is probably ahead there. So I think the SEC and the Big Ten are probably evenly matched. And then I think the Big 12, surprisingly, I think the Big 12 and the ACC are right there at 3rd and 4th. The ACC's issue is they kind of really had one team last year carrying them with Clemson. Clemson's obviously one of the top teams in the nation. But the Big 12 was surprisingly good from top to bottom with some quality football then. And I think the Pac-12 kind of comes in. They had a really disappointing season last year. So that's how I see it as far as the 5 power conferences.
What do you say, Stephen?
When I look at it, kind of just going off of what Mike said there, you look at the Big Ten, this is not just a good conference, but it's a good conference of coaches. When you talk about Urban Meyer, I know he's going through the situation at Ohio State right now. When you look at Urban Meyer, Jimbo Fisher, Mark D'Antonio, James Franklin, also at Wisconsin, Paul Chryst, even Minnesota has brought in P.J. Fleck, and that's going to be somebody that's going to be great for years to come in the coming years. So the coaching of the Big Ten a lot better than the coaching of the SEC. Now, the SEC getting a lot of those quality coaches back. We will see how Kirby Smart continues, what Jimbo Fisher does at Texas A&M, how Jeremy Pruitt intends to bring up Tennessee. But we're seeing more so of the quality coaches return to the Southeastern Conference. But from a coaching standpoint, most definitely the Big Ten has it. Big Ten, SEC, neck and neck. I agree with Mike on the count of Big 12 slightly better than the ACC. My thing is for the Big 12 is who takes it out of the Big 12 because it's so wide open. Oklahoma, no more Baker Mayfield. Can the backup quarterback Kyler Murray bring that same type of confidence to that team? TCU, no more Kenny Hill. Iowa State had a pretty good year last year. Oklahoma State had a pretty good season. West Virginia has Will Grier. I mean, who really comes out of that Big 12? And then Texas, I mean, Tom Herman, here's your shot. You've been talking about, we're the big dog down here in Texas. Here's your shot, Tom Herman, to take it. So I agree with Mike in the sense of Big Ten, better overall coaches. Both conferences, Big Ten and SEC, neck and neck there. I like the Big 12. What does Tom Herman do to make sure that Texas takes it this year? And then the ACC, who can stand there with Clemson? Is it Miami? Is it Willie Taggart at Florida State? Remains to be seen.
This is our big SEC season preview here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. Please like, comment, and subscribe for the best insightful analysis that you're going to find, discussion, and debate here on a daily basis. We are going to march through the East and then the Western Division unless we have a guest join us. So we're going to go a bit out of order in deference to our guest. And we've got Philip Jordan on the line from Last Word on College Football. You can also join him on his Football Report podcast. Philip, how you doing tonight?
Doing good, Mark. Thanks for having me tonight. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Those Auburn Tigers at one point in the season took down 2 number ones in the span of 3 weeks and then found a rough ride toward the finish line, of course, with the SEC championship game loss after scoring the first drive and touchdown of the game against Georgia. And, of course, the Peach Bowl effort against UCF. So it starts with Jarrett Stidham. I'm going to let you take it away in regards to your pluses and minuses. We know that Auburn's a really good team, one of the 10 or 12 best in the country, but starting with a big shootout in a place that they're very familiar with playing football games against Washington on this opening Saturday. Your thoughts on the plus side and maybe some concerns about Auburn football?
Plus side, and you said it right there, Jarrett Stidham. This team is going to go as far as Jarrett Stidham takes them. Last year's team was built around Kerryon Johnson, but this year I believe this offense is built around Jarrett Stidham. The whole thing on the offseason been talked about. Will he be able to have more control over the offense, calling plays audible at the line of scrimmage? The reports, last season, that's something he wanted, more control of the offense. But with that said, my biggest concern, a minus, a negative here at Auburn, is the offensive line. Of course, Herb Hand gone. He's gone off to Texas. Now you bring in J.B. Grimes, who was there from 2013, 2015. Offensive line was pretty good there. So what do they do there? And negative, who's going to be the running back? Cam Martin should be the starting running back against Washington. A lot of talk out of fall camp about Bobby Whitlow. Really interesting in him. But also the defense. If it wasn't for the Clemson Tigers, the Auburn Tigers would have the best defensive line in all of college football, all the NFL talent they have there. So that's a positive for the Auburn Tigers. Another negative, something to look out for, is if the defensive secondary. In the state of Alabama, we hear all about Alabama's secondary is, replacing their guys. Auburn's got to replace 3 guys, including Carlton Davis, who was their lockdown corner from last season. So if the defense has a weakness, it could be the secondary. But that great defensive front could cover that up if the secondary is a weakness.
You might get a few arguments there, Philip, from Ohio State and Alabama on defensive front, but I'm going to let first Mike take it away with his thoughts on Auburn and any questions he has for you.
So, Philip, you talked about Kerryon Johnson being the centerpiece of the Auburn last year. What's the running game at Auburn going to look like this year behind Jarrett Stidham? If Jarrett Stidham's going to be the key cog in that offense, no team in the SEC can be one-dimensional. How are they going to look with a running game to support Jarrett Stidham and the passing attack?
Well, Mike, this is, Auburn has 9 straight seasons of having a 1,000-yard rusher. But I think this year might be the year where that gets broken. And I think Auburn as a collective unit can get that done at the 1,000-yard mark, but just not one guy individually. Like I said, Cam Martin, Bowie Whitlow. I want to see if Asa Martin gets some play too. Devin Barrett will be in there, which he's supposed to take the Eli. So getting involved with running game. So I think it's going to be collection running backs by committee, not necessarily just one guy like it's normally been under Gus Malzahn.
One more question. A tough opening season game against Washington there in Atlanta. How do you think Auburn responds if they lose against Washington first week of the season? Does it kind of carry over like it did last year with the loss to Clemson early on, which seemed to affect them in the early part of the season? They didn't seem to catch their stride until the second half of the season. They lost big. They lost against Clemson last year, lost the Peach Bowl against UCF. They come in and maybe lose against Washington opening week after finishing 2017 strong. How do you think that will affect the mindset of the team?
It's going to definitely add pressure to them because, last season they lost to Clemson, you lost to LSU early. You had to win out. And do you want to have to put yourself in a situation once again at the end of the season, you have to beat Georgia and Alabama, and this time you go into their places. You go to Athens, you go to Tuscaloosa, and you saw what happened last season. Auburn was worn down when they got to Atlanta. I think that's a big reason why they got beat by Georgia is they were just worn down. Kerryon Johnson worn down, the entire team, just the pressure of having to win and be at that level every single week finally got to them. So you need to win against Washington. You don't need to have an early season hiccup. And you also, in the 6th game and on the schedule, you also have to go to Mississippi State. I don't think you want to go in that situation with a loss. You want to come out the first half of the season 6-0 and set up, well, maybe you can almost take a mulligan against either Georgia or Alabama and still get to Atlanta.
Steven, Bama guy, Auburn. You got to mix it up. Let's go.
I think my biggest question in terms of when you look at the Auburn Tigers is Auburn on the offensive line. I know you mentioned got to replace some pieces there, including one Brayton Smith, who did a fantastic job. How have the Tigers mix and match that group to make sure that Coach Malzahn gets the best 5 guys on the field? Because when you talk about the Washington Huskies, Chris Peterson returns some dogs on the defense, whether it's the front line, the linebacking core. How has Auburn fine-tuned that offensive line?
Well, I think it's going to be a work in progress early in the year. You're going to have a lot of guys there that have played, but, not a great experience. Like you brought up a great player, Braden Smith. I mean, he got drafted for a reason. He was an all-SEC performer for a reason. 2 guys on the offensive line I'm going to be taking an eye on, see if they can be leaders. They can, really head up that group. As you got Mike Horton, and you also got Prince Tagan. Prince Tagan, a lot of people have talked about him a lot since he has got to Auburn. Really want to see if he can really take his game to the next level. And if he does, and like I said, I'm very high on J.B. Grimes, what he can do with the offensive line. I think last season the offensive line was a weakness for the team because I don't believe at times they could hold blocks for Jarrett Stidham because Auburn likes to run deep routes a lot, which takes a lot of time for guys to get open. And a lot of times Jarrett Stidham had to eat it because he would get sacked. So I think J.B. Grimes there coming in also. The offensive line will be much improved purely because of coaching this season. And that is the biggest change I think Auburn has is the new offensive line coach.
MarkRogersTV, the voice of college football, with our big SEC preseason special, with the season, of course, just a day away. All right, and big matchups with LSU, Miami, Alabama, Louisville, and, of course, the Auburn Tigers taking on Washington. For me, this is a bigger game for the Huskies and the Pac-12. Perception, getting the resume win that they need for the conference and the program that is supposed to be the best team this year in the Huskies versus Auburn. If they win the SEC, they can lose this game and they're still good to go toward a college football playoff. Of course, Mike alluded to the confidence, the attitude of the team coming out of a maybe poor performance, and then that's an intangible that we can only address in theory. But we got Philip Jordan on the line from Last Word on College Football to break down Auburn. You can also join him on his podcast, The Football Report. Philip, we could talk SEC football. We could talk Auburn all night. Unfortunately, I'm the guy that has to keep track of the timing on all this. So we appreciate you jumping on board here to talk Auburn football.
Thank you. Anytime you want to have me, I'll be glad to come on and talk football and Auburn anytime.
Good stuff. Thank you so much, Philip. All right, we are back in the SEC Eastern Division, and before we dove into any teams in the East, we jumped on with Philip Jordan as he was available to talk Auburn football. All right, let's get to Vandy. I'm starting at the bottom, what I project to be the bottom of the, so we're going with my order here, and Vandy football, of course, James Franklin, 9-4, 9-4, and since then, Derek Mason has proven to me that he's a tremendous coordinator, and he's a below-average football coach. Not horrible, but an average football coach. So, Stephen, we'll kick it to you on Vandy and your projection for the Commodores.
I see 5 to 6 wins, another 5 to 6 win season for Vandy. It's tough for Derek Mason. You're in a program where it's the GPA school of the Southeastern Conference. You're trying to get as many guys there as you possibly can to play football. Kyle Shermer started off last season pretty well at quarterback at a high efficiency rating, but that immediately went down, after the Alabama game in which he went 4 for 15 passing. Now you lose the most dynamic running back in Ralph Webb, who was probably one of the more underrated backs in the Southeastern Conference, period. So he's gone. You lose his backup, which was a Karai Blasingame. You have a couple of big-time or capable wide receivers. Once again, how will your defense look without Oren Burks as he's gone to the National Football League? It's another 5 to 6 win season for Vandy.
So, I don't know that I would agree with Steven. I think Vandy, I have him at 4-8. Like you, Mark, I have him in 7th place in the SEC East. I do think Steven brings up some good points. The loss of Ralph Webb, I think, will be tremendous loss for their offense. I think Kyle Shermer is probably the most underrated quarterback in the SEC, particularly for his performance last year. Maybe not the best, but the most underappreciated quarterback. However, without Ralph Webb in the offense there, I think defenses will scheme a little bit more towards Shermer. And I think we might see a regression there this year. Typical Vanderbilt, they're going to be very solid on defense. JoJuan Williams at cornerback. I expect him to be a shutdown corner. I think he's potentially an all SEC caliber cornerback to set that side of the field. And, they might not have any superstars. Maybe they had a couple last year. Don't know if they'll have any superstars outside of JoJuan Williams on defense this year, but they're all going to be very solid players. The problem with Vanderbilt is that they live on a razor-thin margin every game. They get a little bit lucky. They get Tennessee at home, so that's a possible winnable game depending on how Tennessee turns out. And they draw Arkansas from the West, with a new program leader there, and then they get their historical rival Ole Miss, who is still not quite back to where they were under the Hugh Freeze era. So there is a chance for Vanderbilt to make some noise, get to that 5 or 6 win season. I have them at 4-8. Again, they live on that razor thin margin of error every week, and they have to bring their A game every week, because if they don't, they're going to lose a game. So I think that's kind of how I see Vanderbilt this season. Unfortunately, they're holding down that number 7 slot in the SEC East.
And Mike, when you're playing razor thin football in regards to margin of error, you can't hit on 3 of 7 field goals. I had to double check that stat. 3 of 7 field goals, that they only kicked 3 field goals last year in getting to 5 and 7, 1 and 7 in the SEC. So I've got them at 4-8. We'll go through the whole predictions later, but they'll pick up a win in the SEC, and I don't see a whole lot more there. A possibility of 3 if they can take out a Tennessee or a Missouri or somebody. They do get Arkansas, so they get a favorable rotation with Arkansas and Ole Miss out of the SEC Western Division. Dari Odeyingbo, also an impact player on defense, 13.5 tackles for loss and 6.5 sacks. They pick up a running back from Illinois, Keshawn Vaughn, who was the number 1 rated running back out of Tennessee a few years ago, who's coming back home to take over for Ralph Webb, one of the most prolific backs in the history of the SEC. So our take on Vandy. Now we move it up to Tennessee, who was technically the worst team in the league last year at 0-8 after winning all 4 non-conference games. So, Stephen, I believe that we can, sip our favorite beverage, take a nap, whatever you want to do. I think this is Mike's deal talking about the Vols.
Well, for Tennessee, it's a year of prove it. Tennessee fans are really looking forward to this season. It's finally Tennessee feels like they're getting back to Tennessee football. 10 years ago, after the departure of Philip Fulmer, Mike Hamilton, the athletic director, brings in Lane Kiffin, a seismic shift for the program. First time since the 60s they brought in a non-Tennessee guy into the program. So you go from the Philip Fulmer era at Tennessee to the lights and shininess of the Lane Kiffin era. Of course, that lasted 1 year. We know how that goes. Bring in Derek Dooley, another non-Tennessee guy, although he has SEC ties. Then we bring in Butch Jones. We all know how that went for the 5 years. So Tennessee fans are glad to be back with Philip Fulmer, the athletic director, Jeremy Pruitt, kind of in that mold, that football coach mold, as opposed to kind of Butch Jones, which, is a football coach, but more of the recruiter, more of the lights and glamour aspect, as opposed to Jeremy Pruitt, who's just kind of a football coach. That's what he is. So Tennessee fans are kind of glad to be back to Tennessee football. Now they have to get back to playing Tennessee football on the field. My concern with Tennessee is a lot of impact players coming in the summer, only having the month of fall camp for that team to gel. Tough game on a neutral site to open up with West Virginia. And then a tremendous stretch right in the middle of the season: Florida, Georgia, Auburn, Alabama, South Carolina. 5 straight games starting week 4. So that's going to, the Tennessee team is going to have to gel very quickly. Again, a lot of transfers coming in. Kaylor Chris. It looks like Jarrett Guarantano is going to start at quarterback, but Kaylor Chris coming in from Stanford. Brandon Kennedy from Alabama, who I think is the most important new addition to the team. Dominique Wood-Anderson, tight end out of junior college. Madre London at linebacker. So, I think for Tennessee, it's all about how quickly they can gel, how quickly they can come together, how quickly they can adopt to the new coaching staff, who I believe is very good. There's talent on that roster. There's a lot of talent on that roster. If they can come together, they can win some games. My one big concern with Tennessee, who I have at 6-6 this year, is the defensive cornerbacks. Not necessarily the entire secondary, but the cornerbacks are going to be young, unproven, and that they're going to have to prevent Tennessee from losing a couple games on big plays. So I have Tennessee at 6-6. And I think the big weakness there is going to be the cornerbacks. They're just going to be very young. They're going to have to grow up quickly.
What you got, Steven?
What I got here for Tennessee, the one player that I really want to see in this secondary step up for the Vols is Nigel Warrior. I mean, this was a big-time get for the Vols. I think he came in the 2016 signing class, if I'm not mistaken, and this is a Jeremy Pruitt type of guy when you talk about taking away the angle, defending the ball on the back end. Mike mentioned this. This team has a lot of talent. I have Tennessee honestly going 5-7, though. It's going to take Pruitt a minute. He could get the 6 wins. It would be nice for him to get the 6 wins his first year, but I see it going 5-7. It's going to take Pruitt a minute to really get established what he's trying to get established there on Rocky Top. But if he can get solid play from Nigel Warrior, the guys in that defensive backfield, then that will bring a lot of promise for the years down the road. But right now, just initially on the surface, I see the Vols at 5-7.
Doesn't somebody need to stick up for Butch Jones? Maybe I'm that guy that needs to stick up for Butch Jones. If he wasn't so annoying, maybe if people looked at actually Mark, what he accomplished it there. No, Mike?
Mark, no.
33 and 41. They were 33 and 41 between 2008 and 13.
He won 9 games with a roster, with an NFL roster. He should have won 11 or 12 games. He had Alvin Kamara, Jalen Hurd, Josh Malone, who's with the Cincinnati Bengals, Alvin Kamara, NFL Rookie of the Year, Joshua Dobbs, quarterback of the NFL.
He bought the groceries, though, too. He brought in those players.
I'm going to say this.
Okay.
I'm
not saying he was great. I'm saying that Tennessee football between 2008 and 13 was 33 and 41 before he got there.
If I buy a 20-ounce steak and then boil it, does that make me a great chef just because I bought a really nice steak and then I boil it? No, you have to be able to cook the steak
but
too.
He had one bad season after back-to-back 9-4s in which they were, you know better than I do, that close to winning the SEC Eastern Division both times.
Mark, in 5 years, he lost to Vanderbilt more times than any coach in Tennessee since 1926. MB Banks, 1920 to 1926. He lost to Vanderbilt more times than any coach in Tennessee history since 1926. 92 years, Mark. 92 years.
I just find it difficult for a program that's winning 45% of their games over the course of 6 years to hire a guy who goes 9-4, and then they have a rash of injuries and they collapse and all that. I get it. One season that he doesn't get one more chance.
It was built on lies. He sat on a throne of lies, Mark. Look, Tennessee.
One thing we know here, Mike, is that he's very depressed at Alabama. I mean, I have not seen this man smile one time. Just looking at him wearing an Alabama polo, sitting next to Nick Saban, he's the Grinch that really stole Christmas because this man does not smile in Tuscaloosa.
Well, you've obviously never been on this the bad side of all Twitter, or else you would know why he never smiles. Look. The bottom line is, you're right. He brought in the groceries, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how good of a recruiter you are if you can't coach the team up on the field. No team has ever won a championship in recruiting. Okay, so I get it. Recruiting is how you build your program, but you have to coach them up on the field. You have to treat your players right. You can't have toxicity in the locker room. He had Derek Barnett, Kurt Magid,
Corey Vereen.
He had Corey Vereen, Kurt Magid, Derek Barnett on defense. He had Alvin Kamara, Rookie of the Year, Joshua Dobbs playing quarterback for the Steelers, Josh Malone, and Jalen Hurd, and then numerous other players that I'm just not thinking about off the top of my head. John Kelly now with the Rams. He had
Jalen Reeves-Maybin, bro.
Jalen Reeves-Maybin out of Clarksville, Tennessee. He had John Kelly playing for the Rams, Alvin Kamara, NFL Rookie of the Year, and Jalen Hurd 400 yards short of being the all-time program leader in the same backfield, and they never won 10 games.
Charlie Strong had NFL teams, and he was winning 5 games, so he's still getting employment.
Oh, okay. But for Tennessee, Charlie Strong was coaching at Louisville. Okay, Tennessee doesn't expect to win 8 wins again. Well,
I'm talking about
Texas. He was in Texas after Louisville. And by the way, Charlie Strong was offered the job at Tennessee before Butch Jones turned it down to go to Texas. So, okay, so what I really don't care about Charlie Strong, but the point is Tennessee fans aren't happy with 8 and 9 wins this season. They're not. Tennessee expects to win 10 or 11 games this season. The expectations at Tennessee are division championships, playing for conference championships, and every few years vying for CFP berths.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All I'm saying is, Mike, as well as you know college football history, you as well, Stephen, we could run down a litany of coaches that had one bad season and were able to turn the ship around and were given a pass for one season. All I'm saying is, I'm not saying that I would want Butch Jones coaching my team. I'm saying that typically when a coach takes over a program that's winning 45% of their games over a long stretch of time, and then he brings them to the brink of college football playoffs, and he goes 18-8 over 2 years, that typically that coach is given more than one bad season to bring it back.
He didn't have one bad season. He had the worst season in the history of Tennessee football. Before last season, there were only 2 teams who had never lost 8 games in the season, and you know both of them. Tennessee was one, and you know who the other is?
It would be in Columbus, Ohio.
It would, Ohio State.
Sure.
And now Tennessee, for the first time ever, lost 8 games in the season. Last year was the first time in the history of Tennessee football, 118 years, Mark, that they lost every conference game. It was not a bad season. I will challenge your description of 2017. It was the worst season in the history of Tennessee football. You cannot recover from that. The expectations at Tennessee are too big. This isn't Kansas. The bottom line was the stage was too big for Butch Jones.
All right, that's the take on Tennessee football. I took it down a different path. I went to historical there and drudged up a lot of bad memories for Tennessee football fans. And now I'm most likely, based on my history of making comments here, am going to be judged by a number of Tennessee fans that I'm a Butch Jones fan and that I was basically stating that he was an exceptional coach. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that most coaches, after improving a program markedly, usually get more than one mulligan of a season. Typically, that's what most programs will give a head coach. We would march on to Kentucky, but we're waiting for Kevin McGuffey from Last Word on College Football, who will be joining us soon. Why don't we talk some Mizzou? Because you talk about a coach that I don't think we can debate, at least for one season, really did the job, and that's Barry Odom in the most difficult place to recruit to. Vandy is one certain category. Mizzou, based on location and tradition and legacy, would be another difficult to recruit to in comparison to its rivals. And Mizzou was able to win 7 games last year. I do think that the comeback down the stretch was a bit overblown. Barry Odom went to the podium after losing to Auburn 51-14 and proclaimed that he was the man to turn it around and they would turn it around. Well, he also looked at the schedule and saw UConn and Idaho and Vandy. So they did play much better football. And then they went to the Texas Bowl and got shellacked by a bad offensive team in the Longhorns. But still, at 7-6, and it's improvement at Mizzou. So what say you, Stephen, about the Tigers coming up this year?
Well, it's going to be all on the arm of Drew Lock, as it should be. Drew Lock, a near 4,000-yard quarterback last year, 3,964 passing yards, 44 touchdowns. He's got weapons around him all over the field. The question for Mizzou, the little thing we like to call defense, does Mizzou have that? We know in today's day and age of football, the new shutout is holding the team to 17 points. Well, can Missouri have enough defense to put with Drew Lock in the offense to create even more wins, to go from 7-6 to maybe 8-4, and really, bring some life to that Tigers program? I still see Missouri as a hinge 7, maybe 8 win team, but definitely 7, just due to I am not sold on the defensive side of the football where Mizzou is. Offensively, they got the horses. But in terms of stopping other teams that got horses too, I'm still not sold on Missouri.
Mark, I'm a little bit more bullish on Missouri. I think Missouri is going to finish second in the SEC East. I think they have a chance at 10 wins. I think they'll probably come in at 9 wins, but I think they got a realistic chance at 10 wins. You look at that offense, yes, I think Drew Lock is the best quarterback in the SEC. His stats last year were incredible. He had 42% more touchdown passes than the second best guy. I think he had like 22% more passing yards. Not only was he statistically the best quarterback in the conference last year, he was far and away statistically the best quarterback in the conference last year. They returned all 5 of their offensive linemen. They've got 2 great receivers out there, Jonathan Johnson and Emmanuel Hall. They got 2 solid running backs, Demaria Crockett leading that charge, and they have who I think is going to finish as All-American tight end Albert Okwuegbunam at tight end there. He is just a matchup nightmare for defense.
12 touchdowns last year.
Yes, particularly in the red zone. I think he's going to be an All-American tight end at the end of the season. But hey, I don't think their defense. I think their defense is going to be better than last year. I think they're going to be better than most people expect. They've got Terry Beckner back. I think he's going to be healthier. I think he's going to be better. He kind of had a great year in 2016. Regressed last year. Had some issues. But they also have a transfer from Texas, Chris Turner, I believe. No, I'm sorry, Jordan Elliott on the defensive line. So I think that Jordan Elliott and Terry Beckner combo on the defensive line are going to create some havoc for other offensive lines. Both of those guys were highly rated coming out of high school. They're linebackers, much like their running backs. Terez Hall leading the way there. They're not superstars, but they're all solid linebackers. The Missouri question is going to be in the secondary. But again, they return 8 starters out of their defense, so they have experience. I really think Missouri is the sleeper team in the conference this year. I could be wrong, but that's just kind of what it looks like to me from this perspective. I have them at second in the East, 9, maybe if they get lucky, 10 wins if they stay healthy. But Steven's right. If something happens to Drew Lock, that's the end of the story for Missouri. Here's the biggest thing about Missouri. For me, the biggest question mark of everything that happened in the offseason was Barry Odom hiring Derek Dooley as offensive coordinator for Missouri. I just don't understand it. I don't understand it. He's got a Porsche in the driveway, and he hands the keys to Derek Dooley. I mean, I just don't get it. I do not get it. Derek Dooley might be the only guy in the entire SEC who can stop Missouri's offense this year.
And he's never been an offensive coordinator, from what I understand.
He's never called plays.
Never called plays.
In any of his coaching duties before. Wide receivers coach for Dallas, head coach at Tennessee, head coach at Louisiana Tech, never called plays. Never been offensive coordinator.
Receivers are going to be tremendous.
I don't understand it.
But to finish up on your point in regards to the defense, they have blue chippers along that first line of the depth chart on defense. You mentioned Beckner, Marcel Frazier, 15.5 tackles for loss. Terez Hall, you mentioned. Cale Garrett had 99 tackles, 10 for loss. He filled up the stat sheet. Yeah, they have players. They got their 2 corners back as well. So they've got some players on defense that aren't great. Terry Beckner, though, was one of the highest rated recruits coming out of high school. But Drew Lock, I'm not quite as on that Superman tier of an evaluation on Drew Lock as some are. I think he's really good. I'm interested to see him play a number of games this year against the same competition, but he made it a game against Georgia, and few did in that division. So he's got Emmanuel Hall coming back at 25 yards per catch. So he's the guy that gets downfield. Yeah, and as you mentioned, the tight end is a matchup, a nightmare for defenses. So I've got Mizzou. We can talk about it later, but at 4-4 in the conference and 7-5 overall, with a loss somewhere there, whether they go to West Lafayette and make amends for what happened in Columbia against Purdue last year, or they've got a difficult, sneaky difficult game against Memphis later in the season, non-conference. But of course, for them, they're looking at the SEC schedule. And unfortunately for them, Bama comes up in the rotation, and they have to deal with them as well. All right. Mike, we talk about this all the time. We do as well, Stephen, but especially with Mike, since we talk Tennessee, is about that legacy of the SEC Eastern Division, the tiers of programs, and it's that glut of South Carolina, Kentucky, Missouri now, Vandy not so much, but who's going to win the games between that second division? Well, South Carolina is trying to push themselves out of that mix, but Kentucky's still firmly entrenched, despite what we could say are baby steps toward becoming a contender in the SEC Eastern Division, 5-7, 5-7, then, a couple 7-5s, but they got to a better bowl game this year, and they played better. And who knows, if the official wouldn't have gotten in the way, maybe they win the game against Northwestern. Maybe Benny Snell's just that valuable and worth 1 point on the scoreboard. And with that, we bring in Kevin McGuffey from Last Word on College Football to help us with those Cats. So, Kevin, how you doing tonight?
I'm doing good. How are you guys?
We're doing well. Doing well. So we want to know the take on Kentucky football. We know that you have absolutely no experience at quarterback. So that's not a good place to begin, but I guess they can pivot well and hand the ball off.
Right, right. Yeah, the quarterback situation came down to Terry Wilson, who's a redshirt freshman, and Gunnar Hoke, who's also, as you said, never played a game in college football. And Coach Stoops, Mark Stoops, made the decision on Monday that Terry Wilson will be the guy going forward. I was a little surprised. You and I had talked about earlier in the summer. I thought that maybe Gunnar Hope would start the season, and then Wilson would be the starter going forward. But they decided to go with Wilson, and he offers the cats that run pass option that they probably haven't had in many, many years. You go back to Shane Boyd like 10, 15 years ago, or even Pookie Jones before that. But as you said, I think the game coming up on Saturday against Central Michigan would just be a matter of handing the ball to Benny Snell and getting out of the way.
Kevin, quick question from my side. It's a couple of injuries this training camp. How are those injuries on defense going to affect Kentucky, and do they have the depth? Mark talked about Kentucky kind of being in the second tier in the East. Has Stoops been able to build up enough depth on defense to fill in a couple of those key injuries, particularly on defense?
Yeah, they in Stoops' sixth season now, they think that they have the depth now that they haven't had, since he's been here. You're talking about Josh Paschal, who was expected to step up and fill in for Denzel Ware, who left the program this year. He got suspended for the Music City Bowl, and then Paschal came in with he has a malignant melanoma in his foot, and he's being treated right now, and they hope that he can come back and play later this season, but they just don't know right now. But yeah, they think that they've got guys that can step up. And then you have and then on offense, they lost Landon Young, the starting left tackle. He blew his knee out in practice on Friday, and he, they have a couple of guys who can fill in, who they think can fill in from him. One of them is E.J. Price, who was a former USC recruit, and then another guy, Nasir Watkins. But yeah, Paschal, I think, is a big loss, but I think they can. They have a true freshman in Chris Oates, who they think can do some good things. You still have Jordan Jones. You've got Josh Allen. They moved Josh Allen to the other side of the ball this year in hopes to get him more where he can get at the quarterback more. But yeah, to your point, Coach Stoops thinks that in this sixth season they finally got some depth and some experience that they can use, that they can do some good things this year.
One of the thoughts that I had, Kevin, I know you mentioned at quarterback, Kentucky, not a lot of experience there, but how has the offensive coordinator, along with Mark Stoops, kind of guided these guys? Because at some point, you're going to have one of these guys be able to stretch the football downfield and create some type of balance to help out with Benny Snell. So what's been the quarterback room in terms of offensive coordinator, quarterbacks coach, and Mark Stoops trying to put the best game plan together to help these guys?
Well, I think that's one of the things that why they chose Wilson. He's got, he has, to use a cliche, he's got a cannon for an arm. He's good to throw. He can throw the ball really, really far downfield. Gunnar Hoke is more of a precision passer. And I think that, to answer your question, they're going to be, they're going to try to establish the run with Benny Snell, and then they're going to try to take some shots downfield, whether it's Lynn Bowden, Taven Richardson, they have Dorian Baker coming back this year. I think just what put it in Wilson's favor was just the fact that, he has that dynamic playmaker ability, and he can throw the ball, 60 yards down the field. Now, whether, he can do it with some accuracy, we'll find out. And I think they're going to, kind of bring him along slowly. You'll see, a lot of, as I said, you'll see a lot of Benny Snell on Saturday, but I think it's just the overall package that you have with Wilson and Eddie Gran, the offensive coordinator, Darren Henshaw, the quarterback's coach. They just feel like right now he's their better option of the two.
Got Kevin McGuffey on the line from Last Word on College Football, breaking down Kentucky football. This is our big SEC season preview special here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. We'll take a quick reset to let you know that we've got a weekly newsletter starting this Monday. It's my take on the college football weekend. Also, a channel update and also facts, trends, stats that you won't find anywhere else. So please sign up for the weekly newsletter. And if you got a good name for the group, certainly send that my way as well. But send your email to MarkRogersTV@gmail to get on the list. Also, of course, like, comment, and subscribe. That helps advance the content here on YouTube. And as we get you set for 2018 with the big Northwestern Purdue game highlighting Thursday night, big week in the SEC, as well as LSU, Alabama, and Auburn all get tested. Kentucky against Central Michigan, as Kevin McGuffey joins us. So, Kevin, ceiling and floor for the Cats. What are your thoughts there?
I think the ceiling, opposed to actually that just went up this past weekend, their Last Word on College Football, I've got the Cats going 7-5 and playing in Kansas State in the Liberty Bowl. I think 7 wins is probably the ceiling this year. I think the schedule is a whole lot more difficult than what they had, last year. You've had a lot of people around here talk that, you put this year's team with last year's schedule and Kentucky can maybe win 8 or 9 games. On the flip side, I think the floor is, 4 or 5 wins. There's some of these games that are going to could be really tight. And it's just a matter of, can they win? Tennessee, they have Tennessee down there. They haven't won in Tennessee and Knoxville since 1984. That's a kind of a toss-up game. They have several others. South Carolina, Missouri. I'm sure you guys were talking about these teams earlier. Kentucky's beat Missouri 3 years in a row and beat South Carolina 4 years in a row. So they want to try to help. They want to try to extend that streak. But I say the ceiling is 7 wins and the floor is maybe 4 to 5.
All right, I'm looking at 6-6 myself, so I'm right in that range as well at 3-5 in the SEC. And as you mentioned, not a horrible draw, but certainly not an easy one out of the SEC Western Division, with Mississippi State being the cross-division rival. That needs to go away completely. But anyway, taking on Mississippi State in a meaningless rivalry of sorts, and Texas A&M being the other game. Check out my SEC scheduling breakdown of how the conference scheduling could be fixed. But anyway, what else are we looking at with Kentucky? If Benny Snell goes down, let's say if I'm looking to see if I even jotted down anybody else. We got a couple. Who do we go to if Benny Snell goes down?
If Snell goes down, you probably got the 2 backups are A.J. Rose, who had a really, really good spring camp. He was the star of the spring football game, ran for 134 yards and 3 touchdowns. And behind him, or actually they're kind of like an either or, is Siam King, a guy who did some really good things in limited time last year. So those are the two guys that you're looking at should something happen to Snell. And then, they could always they have a couple of freshmen. With that new rule this year, I think Kentucky's going to be one of those schools, where freshmen can play up to 4 games. They have Cavassier Smoke, who they think is going to be a big-time player. He came from Alabama. They got him out of Alabama this past season. He could be somebody who could fill in. But yeah, it's going to be if something happened to Benny, it would be either King or Rose in the backfield.
Kevin McGuffey talking Kentucky football. Join him and the rest of the fine folks there at Last Word on College Football as they set us up for 2018 as well. Kevin, we appreciate you jumping on the line to break down the Cats.
Oh, no problem. Thanks for having me on, Mark, and thanks talking to you guys. Always appreciate it.
We will see you soon.
All righty. Thank you.
That leaves us with what most people would consider to be the 3 best teams in the SEC Eastern Division. Of course, not so much last year with Florida's finish at 4-7. But Mike, I will actually. I'm sorry, I thought we had somebody else jump on the line, but my eyes were deceiving me. Okay, we will continue with the Gators here with Mike, we'll let you take on your favorite football team. Florida football. Felipe Franks just named the starter officially. Didn't surprise anyone. Dan Mullen obviously taking the reins there in Gainesville. We would all believe that to be a tremendous hire for that program that made total sense. Your take on the Gators, Mike?
Yeah, I think for the Gator fans, I think it's going to be a little bit more of the same. I think Dan Mullen will get the program turned around, but I'm not sure Felipe Franks is his guy. I think he's going to be looking to get his guy in at quarterback. Again, kind of a lot of the same as last year. I think their defense is going to be pretty strong. I think they're going to have a really good secondary. David Reese at linebacker is pretty exciting. When you look at the his fundamentals. As a linebacker, he's not flashy, but if you look at the way he plays the position, it's almost as textbook as you can get from a linebacker. David Reese there at Florida. So I really think I'm not buying into the Florida hype so much. I think they go 7-5. I think they're either Florida or South Carolina finishes third in the SEC East. I have them at fourth in the SEC East. 7-5. Again, I think that's just a situation where Dan Mullen's going to have to it's going to take a season or two for him to get his guys in, his system implemented, particularly at the quarterback position. I think he can get some talent in on the offensive side. I just don't know that they have the talent to challenge Georgia. Certainly they don't have the talent to challenge Georgia. I don't think they have the talent there to clearly distinguish themselves as the number 2 team in the East.
Stephen, as Mike mentions, I'm fascinated long-term to see what Dan Mullen can do because he won at Mississippi State, but he didn't have the resources and wasn't held accountable to winning huge and shouldn't have been. But now, no excuses. You win big at Florida or else. And he certainly seems to be the guy that could possibly pull it off.
Mike's got him at 7-5. I actually have the Gators at 8-4. I think Dan Mullen picks up that 8th win somewhere down the line this season. I think he picks up an 8th win. They've got talent on both sides of the football. It's just not only developing that quarterback and getting his quarterback, but having that offensive line that can really create the favorable matchups for them. So I look at Florida. I got the Gators at 8-4.
All right, my thoughts on the Gators. Obviously, as Mike explained, Felipe Franks, not necessarily Dan Mullen's first choice to be a quarterback, but that's what he's got right now. And he's got a mobile guy who needs to improve on 54%, 9 touchdowns, 8 picks. Emory Jones is the guy long-term that you would expect to take over the reins there. This team is loaded at running back with the likes of Malik Davis, Jordan Scarlett's back, LaMichael Pirine. They can hand it to any of these guys. And the offensive line, which was giving them all sorts of issues a few years ago, is pretty good right now, led by Martez Ivy, and 112 starts coming back between 8 players. They got plenty of talent at wide receiver. Can they get them the football? Of course, we know wide receiver is the most dependent position on the football field. And Tyree Cleveland, Van Jefferson, they've got all sorts of talent there. Kadarius Toney's an interesting guy that's a matchup issue that they can do different things with, jet sweeps and the like. The defense has been exceptional since, Urban Meyer, but through some off seasons with Jim McElwain. And before that, of course, Will Muschamp. But the defense is slipping season by season, slipping. The linebackers are depleted. They'll be good on defense, but maybe not good enough to carry a mundane offense. And actually, this could be a good segue to South Carolina. We got Will Gunter joining us from 107.5 The Game there in Columbia, South Carolina. So he's got an eye on the Gators from time to time. So, Will, thanks for joining us. And before we talk South Carolina football, give us your thoughts on Florida.
I think it's a transition year for them. You knew the talent level has been declining since Will Muschamp left. You look at Jim McElwain's recruiting classes, you saw a lot of talent leave on defense. And also you've seen a lot of talent that has not come in on offense and has gone other places. And so now with Felipe Franks, who I think is capable of running Dan Mullen's offense, they've got a chance to be a quality football team. 9-3 would certainly be the ceiling. Maybe 7-5. I think, obviously you look at that trip to Starkville. South Carolina has to go to the trip to Starkville for the Gators. Obviously, it's going to be a big one Dan Mullen's already called it the biggest game in Mississippi State history. South Carolina going down there. I mean, that's 2 swing games to go along with a huge swing game against first-year coach Willie Taggart and the Seminoles. So, I think you look at Florida this year, they're not going to necessarily out-talent people like they have in the past. It could be a season where they're having to get by on coaching. And the one thing, unfortunately, and I love Dan Mullen. I think the world of Dan Mullen. But Dan Mullen's shown us during his time at Mississippi State, he'll lose one game somewhere along the way that he wasn't expected to lose. So I think it's going to be a fascinating season for the Gators in terms of trying to rebuild that talent back to where it was, back to where that fan base was. But you look at them right now, even now we're going into September. They're 11th in the SEC in recruiting. It's an uphill battle for the Gators right now, and they run the risk of kind of being passed by South Carolina to battle Florida, to battle Georgia for the year-in, year-out title there in the Eastern Division.
Will Gunter joining us from the all-new early game, 107.5 The Game there in Columbia, South Carolina. And Will joins me on a regular basis to talk the SEC and the nation. All right, the Gamecocks from 3 wins to 6 to 9. Now, the next step, you talk about some rarefied air in terms of trying to make progress up from 9 wins, Will. We've talked about the talent there. It's not exceptional, but it's such a different roster than it was just a couple of years ago. And so where do you stand on the South Carolina football team, especially since you got to see him a little bit in camp? Of course, you can't see the meaningful stuff, but considering what you took in during August, your thoughts about South Carolina?
I mean, they're a better football team. It's a mass improvement from where they were when Will Muschamp took over. And the wide receiver position, the defensive line position, is 2 great examples of that. You're talking about a wide receiver position that 2 years ago had a freshman in Brian Edwards, had a returner that we knew could be good in Deebo Samuel, but was unproven after that. And now you look to this year and you see Brian Edwards going into his junior year. You see a Deebo Samuel coming back for his season. So that's one position. Shy Smith or Trey Smith, the guy they got out of Tucker, Georgia, Josh Vann. They're deep at wide receiver. Defensive line, they're an improved team. Again, Javon Kinlaw is, I think, potentially the breakout player in the league if he can live up to the hype that he's kind of built for himself coming in from junior college. The rest of the defensive line is a little bit smaller but still talented. At linebacker, they're better. They're lacking depth, but they're better. And in the secondary, a lot of good players. The talent is better. I don't know, though, if it's necessarily better than a lot of the teams on the schedule. I think South Carolina fans have looked at this schedule and think that it's a cakewalk to 9 victories. South Carolina's not a better team talent-wise than Texas A&M. I don't see that. Mississippi's better than people give them credit for because they're on probation. I don't know if South Carolina's that much more talented than Florida and has to go there. So 9 wins is going to be a challenge. I've got 4 big swing games we can get into that I think define how this season goes for South Carolina. But certainly the talent is improving. It'll improve in 2019, or in 2019. It'll improve in 2020. That's the Will Muschamp MO, and certainly the way he's recruiting is improving this team.
Will, that kind of segues into my question. Not so much talent, but consistency with South Carolina. If you look at last season with South Carolina, they started really well with North Carolina State, Missouri. They looked good against Arkansas in the middle of the season. And I thought they looked good against Florida at the end of the season. But in between North Carolina State and Florida, there were some consistency issues. They didn't look good in their loss to Kentucky or A&M, and in their wins against Louisiana Tech and Tennessee, they didn't really look good even in those wins. Everybody knows that college football is much more of an eye test than NFL. What is Muschamp doing? What can South Carolina do to get that level of consistency that will get them into second place in the SEC East and will get them year in and year out 8, 9, possibly 10 wins? How do they get that consistency there?
Well, I think some of it is experience. You look at it, they were still a young team last year with a lot of freshmen and sophomores. This is now a more senior-laden team, junior-laden team. I looked at the depth chart yesterday when it came out. There was only 6 true freshmen on the depth chart. That's a gigantic step for them from years past. And so when you talk about 3-year starters like Jake Bentley, like Brian Edwards, you talk about guys who've been in the system for a year, I think, or for 2 years, I think that's going to go a long way toward providing that consistency. I'm interested to see what Brian McClendon is as offensive coordinator. You talk about the consistency. Defensively, they were consistent all year long. They were a solid football team. You go back to that Texas A&M game, the defense puts them in a position to win. The offense absolutely blows that game over the final 20 minutes. I mean, they've got a 10-point lead in College Station with about 20, 25 minutes to go, and they lose the ball game because the offense cannot get first downs, cannot protect Jake Bentley. So you look at that game, obviously Louisiana Tech, the defense played well enough, and the offense stunk for 3 quarters. So the bottom line is Brian McClendon, better offensive play, but also experience, I think, is a large part to this team taking that next step. Because like you said, for all we want to talk about 8-4 regular season, they're a field goal away there at the end of Louisiana Tech and a stop against Tennessee from being a 6-6 team and going to Birmingham or Shreveport, and the level of excitement for this team being nowhere near what it is sitting here 2 days away from the start of college football season.
Yeah, certainly. That Tennessee game, they came rushing down the field, ready to score, as Mike knows better than both of us, because it was very, I'm sure, locked in his memory. But I remember watching that game, and the offense stalled inside the 10 late in the game, right at the wire. And I'm looking at this defense, Will, and I see DJ Wanham, tremendous player, TJ Brunson, star players, impact players there. But the secondary, Rashad Fenton comes back, but wow, the secondary could be a serious issue.
You know, here's why it won't. And I say this, I think they're talented back there. I think they're unproven to an extent. JT Ivey is going to be a starter at one safety position that he's a grad transfer from Rice. They've really liked him. He actually was out for most of fall camp with a hip injury and has gotten the starting position in 2 weeks since he came back, was a guy they're very high on. Stephen Montag is a perfect example of a Will Muschamp recruit. Nobody recruited Stephen Montag out of Hutchinson or out of community college in Kansas. South Carolina brought him in late. He has been a great college football player. He will not have a career professionally, but he is a great college football player that has gone on to be successful in that system, to be where he's supposed to be, to understand the defense. He's probably a step slow, an inch short, but that guy is the perfect example of Will Muschamp identifying a guy who fits the system. They're as confident with him as one safety position as anywhere on the team. And then you mentioned Rashad Fenton. Keyshawn Nixon is going to get the start at the other defensive back. We are all excited down here. We're interested to see J.C. Horn, the big-time recruit out of Alpharetta, Georgia, who's already worked his way into the starting lineup and maybe supplants Keyshawn Nixon halfway through the year. Israel Mukwamu is another freshman defensive back they're very high on. And then you've got a grad transfer from Texas A&M, Nick Harvey, who they're cross-training at Texas A&M. He's from Texas A&M, cross-training him at second, at cornerback, and at safety. We are expecting to hear possibly tomorrow. I can say this now, a possible ruling tomorrow on Jamel Cook. The transfer from Southern Cal was a big-time prospect out of Miami, was a 24/7 Sports top 100 prospect who went to Southern Cal, transferred to South Carolina. He's got 3 years of eligibility. The rumors I'm hearing tonight is we will have an answer on his eligibility tomorrow, and at least there is a high confidence level within the football office that he, a 6'3", 190-pound defensive back, could be eligible to play this year as well.
And there's no word about any kind of a USC tattoo that swayed his decision on where to transfer. Nothing like that.
No.
Okay. Mike, do you have anything for Will before we let him go?
No, nothing else. I'm interested to see. I like your analogy that the defense has talent, yet they're unproven, or not necessarily weak, but just unproven with talent. I was kind of looking at the defense too, but I think consistency is going to be the key for the Gamecocks. I have them at 8-4, so I agree with a lot of things that Will said.
Yeah, we got them stuck in mud as well. 8-4, 5-3. Go ahead, Will.
You look at it. Look, there's 4 swing games for them right now. If I look at the schedule, I see Georgia and Clemson as losses, and then I see 4 swing games for them that will define their season, and that's at Kentucky, a team they haven't beaten 4 years, Texas A&M at home, at Mississippi, and at Florida. Those are the 4 swing games for the Gamecocks. That if you go 1-3 in those games, we're talking about a 7-5 team. You go 3-1 in those games, all of a sudden it's a 9-3 team. Obviously, I'm with y'all. I could see them splitting those games and going 2-2. That Mississippi game coming off of Tennessee, coming to Columbia before they go to Florida certainly would be difficult. I see them kind of splitting that Mississippi Florida set that goes back to back November 3rd and November 10th. And I think that's interesting. But you look at the SEC East right now, and it's a battle. Who can get in there and kind of become that team that's going to challenge Georgia for the next few years? Obviously, Florida, because of Dan Mullen, has the jump on Tennessee. South Carolina with Will Muschamp having some stability and some consistency there, I think has the jump on Tennessee. It'll be interesting to see what happens with Barry Odom and Derek Dooley and how they handle that offense with such a talented quarterback in Drew Lock and where Missouri goes. You know, Kentucky and Mark Stoops certainly needs to improve and get past the 7-win threshold. And then there's always going to be Vanderbilt. It's an interesting division right now because Georgia separated itself so quickly with the talent level and the way they're recruiting. Georgia's not going to come back to the pack. And for South Carolina and even in Tennessee, you know, a lot of programs around here, when you've got three mega powers in Alabama, Georgia, and Clemson, who are all in that, all recruit that state of Georgia where so many players come from, it's difficult to grow and to build your program. And I think that's difficult for Jeremy Pruitt. I even think it's difficult for a program I really like in Auburn and Gus Malzahn, and it's certainly difficult for South Carolina.
I'm trying to measure the statements. We've made such tremendous progress over the last 3 years versus we can't beat Kentucky. Those don't seem
listen, there's people that phone into our radio show every day and say, we don't care what the record is, beat Kentucky.
Wow.
There's no excuse. You know, and I think it's interesting with South Carolina last year. There's no doubt they played their worst game of the season in that Kentucky game. That was by far, you can say what you want about barely beating Louisiana Tech the next week and about getting thumped by Clemson at the end of the season. But that ball game against Kentucky was absolutely brutal. South Carolina had every opportunity in the world to be up 28-0. Depending on how you look at it, you know, one turnover maybe doesn't lead to another. But Kentucky turned it over multiple times there in the first quarter. South Carolina had great opportunities, could never take advantage, and put Kentucky away in the first quarter and ended up falling behind. And even the score, whatever it was, 24-13 or whatever it was not indicative of the game. That thing was far more of a blowout for Kentucky than it represented. So September 29th, when South Carolina goes up there, is certainly a big game for the Gamecocks to break that losing streak.
Love talking SEC football with Will Gunter from the all-new Early Game 107.5 The Game, Columbia, South Carolina. Will, thanks for stopping by. You have a great rest of your evening.
You too. Hey, it's right around the corner. We finally get to find out who Nick Saban's going to play quarterback. And he's actually got an easy decision, right? It's not that hard, right?
Yeah, he's got the best quarterback in the SEC. Just ask Mike. Mike has an issue with my SEC quarterback rankings because I named a certain left-hander as the best quarterback in the league.
It's the easiest decision in the world.
Yes, it is.
The NCAA stepped in and saved Nick Saban this year. It's great the way the NCAA stepped in and saved him. He's got the easiest decision in the world. You play Jalen Hurts 4 games, you let him graduate, he transfers out, and he redshirts and he has 2 years of eligibility. Nick Saban's got the easiest job in the world this year. Tunga Viola goes for that Heisman he's already the favorite for despite never starting a game.
Yeah, that pretty much sums it up right there. All right, Will, we appreciate it, man. You take care. All right, and then there was one in the East, and that one is a very big one. The dominant team, maybe the most dominant of any division in college football. Georgia owns the East, even though they've only won it one consecutive season, the one time, of course, in dominant fashion, going 7-1 and all the way within seconds of a national championship. So, Mike, is there anything that derails this for Georgia? I can't imagine, but it's not just even beyond this particular team. It's just ultra impressive what Kirby Smart has done in a very little span of time.
Yeah, you know, that's the thing with Georgia. That's why Georgia fans, why they really appreciated Mark Richt and the job he did there. They knew that Georgia was a sleeping giant. Will talked about a couple things with Georgia, and he's absolutely correct. You know, Georgia, the Atlanta area is recruited very heavily. A lot of top high school talent comes out of there. Georgia's only an hour and a half away. It should be, they're, as far as in-state rivals that are going up against Georgia Tech, it should be fairly easy pickings for the home state school. Of course, they have to battle Alabama and Clemson and Tennessee and Notre Dame and Texas. Everybody that comes into Atlanta. But for the home school, they should at least have a head start on all that talent that's in Atlanta there. but two, they're just talented and they're not coming back to the field. Kirby Smart's brought in a lot of guys. You look at, they lose two all American type running backs to the NFL, Sony Michel and Nick Chubb, and what do? They just replace it with DeAndre Swift, Elijah Holyfield, and Brian Herrien, and then even Mecole Hardman could run the ball out of the backfield too. So the running back position doesn't stop. They lose their starting quarterback last year, and they just fill it in with Jake Fromm, who goes on and has a very solid season. He'll pick up a little bit more of the load. He's going to be better. They returned several of their offensive linemen. They're pretty set at tight end position. They're going to have a good tight end. They do lose quite a bit off that defense. But again, with Kirby Smart being the defensive-minded head coach and the talent they've brought in there, they're going to be okay on defense. They're not going to be as good as they were last year, but they're going to be okay on defense. They've got kind of a stud superstar, pretty much one guy at each position there, linebacker, and secondary. So they might not be as good as they are last year, but as far as the SEC East goes, they're still, to me, head and shoulders above every other team in the division. And their schedule is a little bit easier this year. They have no big-time out-of-conference foe.
And that's the thing. You can have a team that's extremely talented, but maybe you've got some people in place that need to grow, to learn, to develop, but you don't get punched in the mouth with a Miami game or an Oklahoma or whomever in weeks 1, 2, or 3, and you can ease into it. Now, of course, they've got South Carolina in conference, but in terms of an out-of-conference foe, they don't have that second game to add to Georgia Tech like they did last year, traveling to South Bend to take on Notre Dame. And just to outline and underline the wealth of riches, the embarrassment of riches, you mentioned Isaac Nada, a very solid tight end, caught 29 passes 2 years ago. They have 4 other tight ends who were either 4 or 5 stars, which is a position that you typically can't find tons of 4 and 5 stars, but they have 4 or 5 of them, 4 of them that have 4 or 5 star rankings coming into it. It's a wealth of talent. Roquan Smith, again, if they were playing somebody that could really test them early, I would think his absence would be huge because the defense may lose some leadership and cohesiveness. And he was just, we use the term dominant maybe too much. But when it comes to Roquan Smith, who's now with the Chicago Bears, he certainly was 137 tackles last year. So,
yeah, without Roquan Smith, they do not beat Oklahoma.
No, they don't.
No,
absolutely.
Tremendous game against Oklahoma.
Jake Fromm had a hand in that as well.
Certainly,
they brought him along as a game manager. He had that label, and understandably so. But then against Oklahoma, he had to put together 2 drives late in the game, and the very last drive of regulation that I was extremely impressed with. It's still going to burn in my memory, the plays that he made, both from the pocket and then throwing the ball on the run, and then also stepping up and then taking off a few times to convert third downs, and then delivering in the clutch when he needed to. Didn't have a great game against Alabama, but few do. Much better than Kelly Bryant did the week before. But even though people clamor for Justin Fields, hey, his time will be coming, and he's supposed to be an off the charts kind of talent, transcendent kind of player potentially. But Jake Fromm should be, I would think, firmly entrenched as the starter. All right, Mike Laval joining me from Last Word on College Football. You got to join him and the rest of the crew there. They, over the years, whether it's Kevin McGuffey, Mike himself, Tony Syracuse, in the past, Donald King, have just been a tremendous support for me. Come on here on a regular basis to provide me with insight and knowledge on their particular areas, conferences, and the nation. So we've got half done with the SEC Eastern Division. We move on to the West, and we're going to go bottom to top. And I think we would agree here that Arkansas is in a rough place here in season 1 under Chad Morris. Big offensive mind coming from Clemson to SMU, where he went from coordinator to head coach. And he certainly is a program that has a storied tradition, but a difficult spot in regards to competition in division, recruiting base, and what do we need to see out of Chad Morris maybe to make us think, Mike, that he's got a chance for success in the future?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how that Arkansas team develops this year. You kind of look at everything. If you're gonna rebuild a program, the SEC West is probably not the place to do it. Brett Bielema came in. If you look at a blueprint for building a program in the SEC West, you would think it would be based on an effective run game and a solid defense, which is kind of what Bielema brought in, his philosophy, and they just never could get it done. They always seemed like they were one quarter away in one game, and then maybe another game somewhere on the schedule to break in through to get into that 4-3-2 position in the SEC West. They couldn't do it. So now you've got a Chad Morris who's coming in with a little bit different philosophy, much more offensive minded, much more aerial minded, coming in from, like you said, I think coming in from SMU where he had a couple years, and so he's going to try to build that program in one of the two toughest divisions in all of college football. So he's going to have to play Auburn and Alabama and LSU every week. So it's going to be interesting to see how Arkansas builds that program there. I'm not confident they can do it. A lot of unproven resources. And so in addition to rebuilding the program, they're completely changing the system too. We talked about with Florida, we talked about Dan Mullen getting the right guy in. You got to think that Chad Morris wasn't able to get all of his guys in one recruiting class, switching from a Bielema run-heavy offensive philosophy to a Chad Morris, much more balanced, maybe even much more aerial attack there. Cole Kelly's probably got talent, but we really haven't seen him. We really don't know. A lot of stuff with Arkansas is going to be unknown entities. This is going to be a team that we're going to have to watch throughout the season to see how they develop, see how they come together. But it's going to be a long road to hoe to get out of that 7th position in the SEC West, because there's a lot of talented teams over there.
A number of us, including myself and Mike, will study the teams during the offseason, especially as we head toward August and prepare for the season and look at personnel breakdowns, who's coming back, who are the big recruits that could need to step in and fill gaps. And there's a common theme that we see among lesser teams like in Arkansas. And I'm looking at wide receivers and running backs, and I'm seeing a number of productivity coming back, but ineffective to a certain extent. So you wonder whether, okay, is Chad Morris that good of an offensive coach that he's going to be able to scheme and also develop technique and skill development at those individual positions to improve it that much? Or, at least they have experience. These guys know how to play in the SEC. They know it's coming, but they haven't been very productive. And you mentioned the quarterback. It's Cole Kelly, just announced days ago that he will be the starting quarterback after completing 58%, 8 touchdowns, 4 picks in limited time there. So the defense was atrocious and will be most likely going forward as well. And Chad Morris obviously putting John Chavis, who was very successful at Tennessee and LSU, not such a great stay at Texas A&M, but it should be in good hands in the future if they can get the Jimmies and Joes lined up in the recruiting rankings. But Chad Morris not necessarily focusing on defense at his stay at SMU, finished in the advanced metrics, Mike, 119, 91, and 119 out of 130 teams in the FBS at SMU in defense.
Is that bad?
Yeah, it's not real good. It might get you 2 or 3 wins.
Hey, of their 4 wins last year, 3 of them were Florida A&M, New Mexico State, and Coastal Carolina.
And so that Coastal Carolina was a barn burner. You had to pull that thing out.
Yeah, they won that game by 1 point. You mentioned John Chavis there. The one knock on Chavis, he's never been a real energetic recruiter. He's for defensive coordinator, he's much more of the press box scheme guy. So you talk about getting the right guys in. That's an interesting hire. Of course, Chavis is a Tennessee guy from the Fulmer era. So a lot of respect there. But when you talk about energetic recruiting from coordinators, he's probably not the name that comes to the top of the list.
And when you're playing at warp speed on offense or attempting to, it's not necessarily a good balance to trying to protect a defense that isn't ultra talented. But that's the way that Chad Morris rolls. And Eastern Illinois, Colorado State, North Texas, and Tulsa, certainly the right non-conference schedule for Arkansas. But when you get a trip to Fort Collins, you got North Texas, who's a quality group of 5, and Tulsa had been before plummeting to 2-10 last year. It's, there may be another downfall in the non-conference schedule, despite missing Michigan, who pulled out of a game with Arkansas this year, and it's Vandy and Mizzou as the crossover games out of the East for the Hogs. Mike Laval joining me from Last Word on College Football. This is Mark Rogers TV, voice of college football, as we break down the SEC and get you set for this weekend's games in the season for the next 3 to 4 months. We stop at Ole Miss with Matt Luke cleaning up the mess left by Hugh Freeze. Regardless of what his long-term situation is there in Oxford or his coaching legacy down the road, he's a very young man at 41 years old, I believe. And he certainly has shown to be a class act in Oxford, and people respect him. They like him. He's an Ole Miss guy, and he certainly has stabilized the situation, and the players played well for him, Mike, in going 6-6 last year.
They did. Even if you're a rival fan, unless of course you're a Mississippi State fan, you gotta appreciate what Matt Luke is doing there. What Jordan Ta'amu did there. You kind of look at the Shea Patterson thing. You kind of, I think for a long time college football purist fan, not that I'm that guy, but I think for a lot of those fans, I think kind of what Shea Patterson did and Van Jefferson, I think that kind of leaves a little bit of a bad taste in your mouth, and it kind of makes you not really feel sorry, because you don't really feel sorry for anyone, but it kind of makes you appreciate what Matt Luke has to do to get that program back to where they'd like to be. Of course, that Hugh Freeze got it there not the right way. So it kind of balances itself out. But you got to appreciate, unless you're a Mississippi State fan, you got to appreciate what Matt Luke has done there, righting that ship, and some quality football last year. They've got some talent, just like Will Gunter said previously. They've got talent there. AJ Brown's a fantastic wide receiver. I think Jordan Ta'amu can have a good follow-up season to what he did last year. What I'm concerned about with Ole Miss is the depth. I'm not sure they can hang with Texas Tech to open that game. I'm just not sure they have the depth on both sides of the ball. Still not sure about their running game. That's been absent in Oxford for several years now. So I think defensive coordinators are going to focus. They're going to double team AJ Brown, obviously, and I think they're just going to pin their ears back and come after Jordan Ta'amu, who's not the biggest guy on the field. So I have Ole Miss at 6-6 in that sixth slot in the SEC West. I think they're going to look better during the season, although I'm not sure that's going to translate into progress on the record sheet. But I do think they're on the path to getting better over the long term.
Mike, you talk about a free fall. Look at the defense here. So in 2014, that was the Land Shark defense with all those tremendous players that went to the Peach Bowl and then won the Sugar Bowl the next year against Oklahoma State, beat Alabama 2 consecutive years, finished roughly in the top 10. I might be off by a spot or two consecutive years. They were number 2 in the advanced metrics in total defense in 2014. They were number 113 3 years later. So yeah, and they've lost their best players from that team. Marquise Haynes, one of the better defensive ends, moving on to the NFL, and Breland Speaks as well. They have some experience on the first team level, but very, very thin on defense. It's going to be maybe not a team that's going to rack up a ton of wins, but they're going to be fun to watch with, as you mentioned, Ta'amu and Brown, DeMarcus Lodge on offense. They got to replace Jordan Wilkins, 1,000-yard back. But they've got a bevy of guys that can replace him. Eric Swinney, Devon Penniman as well, who played sparingly but produced pretty well. Greg Little, one of the best offensive tackles in college football. So they'll put some points on the board, and they'll be fun to watch, and they'll be scary for some teams in that mid-tier of the SEC. Yeah,
certainly. They have talent there, and just like Will Gunter talked about, really with both divisions, the teams 2 through 6, every game they play with all those other teams are swing games.
Mike Laval joining me from Last Word on College Football. We're breaking down the SEC, our big season preview here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. If you want to join the weekly newsletter, you send your email to MarkRogersTV at Gmail, and what you get is my take and perspective on the weekend's play. You get stats, trends, and facts that you won't find in one spot anywhere else, and a channel update as well. As we move on to the Aggies of Texas A&M, and you talk about a team that is all in, or a school and program when it comes to football, and saying we want the brass ring, this is it at Texas A&M.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see. When you talk about coaches, new coaches in the conference, I think this is the most intriguing new coach hire, because with all the other ones, it's either a coach coming from a G5 program or a coordinator coming up, kind of rising and taking the reins at SEC school. With Jimbo Fisher, you have a guy who kind of did pulled the opposite of the Urban Meyer. He's got a national championship, very successful program there in Tallahassee, and he comes over to the SEC. So he's willing to risk, his reputation as a top tier coach coming into the SEC. If he fails miserably at Texas A&M, people can say, oh, well, he came to the SEC and he couldn't succeed. So maybe it's not as hard to succeed in the ACC. He was able to, or he's willing to put that reputation up for risk. So I think what Jimbo Fisher does at Texas A&M is going to be really intriguing to watch. I think he's got talent there. The school supports him. Tremendous stadium, a lot of money. He's getting paid a lot of money. So we'll see. I'm not sold on the quarterback situation. Kellen Mond named the starter today, I believe, today or yesterday. With Nick Starkel, I think planning to play some in the opening game, possibly. I'm not a big fan of the two quarterback thing. I think both of those guys have talent. I'm just not a big fan of either one of them. I just don't think they're the guys that can lead Texas A&M to a division title. Now, does Jimbo need a division title? Well, when you're a guy who's won national championships before, you're not going to want to sit there in third and fourth place. And when they're paying you $70-something million, the people paying you that don't want you sitting in third or fourth either. So I think after Orgeron, the pressure is going to be on Fisher very quickly because of you're absolutely right. He was given the keys to the kingdom. And if you've ever been at College Station, that's a big kingdom over there. And they are desperate to get to that top level of college football. They just, and really beyond anything else, they just want to stick it to Texas. They know that Texas is down. They know the Big 12 is down. And they just want to be able to, look at Texas and say, hey, look at us. We're succeeding at the highest level. So how about that? So there's going to be a lot of pressure there very quickly. The talent's there. That's a place where you can get guys. Obviously, Houston's right in their backyard. They can do a couple hours over to San Antonio, a couple hours over to Dallas and recruit heavily in that Texas market. So they got talent there. Let's just see how well they can bring it together. I think Jimbo Fisher is a good coach. I think it was a good move for him. I think his time at Florida State was done. Some personal issues there and just didn't fit with some other things. So I think it's going to be beneficial for him. Now let's just see if he can put all the pieces together again in the SEC West. When you're building the program and you're trying to put things together, that's maybe not the best division to do it in, but he's accepted the challenge, and I'm really eager to see how he does with that challenge.
As you allude to, Mike, the quarterback battle is not necessarily over. Yes, a game one starter has been named. It's Kellen Mond, who is a true sophomore. We had exactly the same situation this time last year. We had Kellen Mond. We had Nick Starkel. That season, 2017, Starkel wins the job. He plays against UCLA. He's very productive. They race out to that historic 44-10 lead that was blown. He gets hurt. Mond takes over. They don't play well in the second half. They get surpassed by Josh Rosen and company. And then Starkel, once he gets healthy, he reclaims the job. And the last time he was on the field, Mike, all he did is go 42 for 63 for 500 yards and 4 touchdowns in the bowl game against Wake Forest, a 55-52 loss. So he's a better and more accomplished passer at 60% versus 51%, better TD to pick rate, 14-6 versus Mond's 8-6. But Mond brings the dimension of running the ball at almost 7 yards per carry, non-sack yardage included there. So maybe that's what Jimbo's looking for, unless Mond's improved that much through spring and summer drills as a passer.
Yeah, I don't study Kellen Mond too much. I just, from watching him last year and seeing some film, he's a tremendous quarterback, but he's got a very awkward motion, drops that elbow very low and has an awkward release. So for him to really get to the elite level of passing, I think there's a lot of fundamental stuff he's going to have to work on.
2 years ago, Travion Williams and Keith Ford averaged over 6 yards per carry. That dropped to 4.3 last year. They had shuffling all over the offensive line, injuries. Eric McCoy's a really good player at center. If Jimbo can get the offensive line fixed, we don't usually talk as much as we should about line play, especially on the offensive side, but those are the guys that make it all work, and they had issues at A&M last year, and you can't have issues along the offensive line when you've got NFL defensive ends and outside linebackers all over the place and D tackles in that division in particular. All right, the chic pick by many, if you're looking for a dark horse, is Mississippi State in the SEC West, Mike. Joe Moorhead comes in. He has never run this kind of program. He ran Fordham. He was the offensive coordinator at Penn State and is given much credit for leading what was the most explosive offense in the Big Ten for the past 2 years. But they had a couple guys to work with there. So Moorhead takes over at Mississippi State. Instantly, he gets off the plane and he starts talking about fitting players for championship rings, and we're going to take over the West. And I'm putting words in his mouth, but he's talking big, like, "Hey, we're here to stay, and we're going to compete."
Yeah, I think as a coach, I think he's speaking to his internal audience. I think he's speaking to fans at Mississippi State. They kind of feel like Dan Mullen used Mississippi State as a stepping stone to Florida. I think when you look at the SEC, most of the programs in the SEC are historic programs, and the fan bases are kind of comfortable in their own skins. They might not be happy right now, see Knoxville or Gainesville, but they're comfortable in their skin. They're comfortable in who they are. I think at Mississippi State, you have a fan base that just continues to see themselves as underappreciated, continues to see their coaching position as another stepping stone. So I think Joe Moorhead comes in, he's talking to the Mississippi State fans. He says, "Hey, we're here to win. This, just trying to kind of build up that support and that momentum." Again, he's not talking to the other teams. It's not bulletin board material. He's not talking to the national media. He's talking to his internal audience. And I'll tell you what, he's talking big, but he's got some big time players there. And it all starts like just what you were talking about with Texas A&M and the questions their offensive line. It starts up front with the defensive line. You look at Jeffrey Simmons and Montez Sweat. I tell you what, that's going to be one of the best defensive lines in the nation. They're gonna cause a lot of havoc up front. And if you're a team like Texas A&M and you've got a shaky offensive line, Mississippi State's not the team you want to play. Then you come over to offense. You got Nick Fitzgerald there at quarterback, suspended for the first game. Just like Kellen Mond, if he can get his passing to 55, 56, even 60% with his running ability, that's going to be a really good team. They've got a really good running back, Arius Williams. And then they have a great wide receiver there in Starkville too. This team's got talent. Dan Mullen did not leave the cupboard empty. Joe Moorhead, I think, to be quite honest with you, I think is probably a better offensive scheme guy than Dan Mullen. Dan Mullen kind of relies on that quarterback. He's a one-player kind of coach. He goes out and he gets that Cam Newton at Florida. He gets that Nick Fitzgerald at Mississippi State. That's kind of what he does. I think Joe Moorhead's more of a comprehensive, more of a holistic coach on offense. I think he's got talent to work with, even at the quarterback position. Their backup, Caden Thompson. Make sure I got it right. Yeah, Caden Thompson. Yeah, yep. Yeah. He's got talent there too. Certainly a better passer than Nick Fitzgerald. So I think Mississippi State's a popular dark horse pick, but I think there's a lot of legitimacy there. I think the defense is going to be really good, especially up front. Their secondary might be a little bit. Their secondary is their question mark on defense, but I think Mississippi State has a chance to challenge in the West. I have Mississippi State at 9-3. I think they're going to be second place in the West. I actually think they move ahead of Auburn. I think they win that Auburn game. They get Auburn at home after games against Kentucky and Florida. So I have Mississippi State at number 2. So I guess I'm one of those guys doing the popular dark horse pick.
Well, I got to say 9-3 sounds pretty good because that's what I've got jotted down right here, and I've already shot my prediction video for Mississippi State. It's 9-3. It's 5-3 in the conferences. They've got one tough date at Kansas State, but I think that they're just a little bit too athletic and too gifted on both sides of the ball for the Wildcats, but it should be an interesting game there in Manhattan. Yeah, Nick Fitzgerald, it stays with me up until now that as a freshman, he walked off the field after a narrow bowl win against Miami of Ohio. They needed a blocked PAT, and Dan Mullen said after all these accolades coming from the sideline reporter about Nick Fitzgerald's performance, mostly running, he's got to be a better passer. We have to get him there. And 55%, 15 TDs, 11 picks. And the stats they don't tell the complete story, but I throw them out there because it's a starting point to start the discussion. I got to think 22-8, 24-8 touchdown to pick ratio feels good for him to be where they need him to be. And you mentioned Keaton Thompson, who was placed in a difficult situation against Ole Miss in the Egg Bowl when Fitzgerald broke that ankle, and he had a rough time against the Rebels. Then he got his footing and played a great fourth quarter and almost brought him back to victory. And then he won the bowl game. He ran for 500 yards and 6 touchdowns last year. Arius Williams, as mentioned, a tremendous back, 1,100 yards, may catch more than 16. Moorhead maybe making him more of a Saquon Barkley type out of the backfield if he has those skills. And you mentioned the defensive front, and also Jerry Green, a guy that doesn't get talked about because Simmons and Sweat are the studs, but he had 11 tackles for loss and 5 sacks. The linebackers are all back. They're loaded there. They're really good. Mark McLaurin had 6 picks as an all-SEC safety. This is the year for Mississippi State. Unfortunately, they had Bama at home last year and should have won the game. They let Calvin Ridley make a big play and get them off the hook, but they've got to go to Tuscaloosa this year. But they do have Auburn in Starkville, so we'll keep an eye on the Bulldogs. As we move our way on through the SEC Western Division, we stop at LSU. I think maybe it's overstated the assumption that LSU is supposed to be great. They've been great from the time Nick Saban took over. His second year, he lifted them to a Sugar Bowl win, SEC championship, through Les Miles up until 4 or 5 years ago when they started losing 3 and 4 games a year. But from the late 70s to Nick Saban in 2000, they were a 55% win program. And since Les Miles' his first few years, they haven't been much better than that. The talent's there, of course, but they are looking at a brutal schedule and uncertainty all over the offense.
Yeah, I'm going to be honest with you, Mark. You talk about the popular pick of Mississippi State to be a dark horse in SEC West. You know, I think LSU is going to be 6-6. I don't see where they win 8 or 9 games. I don't see why on paper they're ranked in the top 25. And it starts at the head coach. Look, I think Ed Orgeron is a great guy. I think he's great for publicity. I think he's great for attention. He's interesting to listen to. It's all nice. It's all fun. But let's look at his track record at head coach. He was not very good at Ole Miss. He was not very good at USC. And he has shown no promises of doing much at LSU. There is a ton of talent at LSU. Per capita, the state of Louisiana puts more people in the NFL than any other state by far. It's not even close. Tremendous football atmosphere down there. Even with the historical, I'm probably going to take some heat here. Even for the historical overratedness of the LSU program, there's still a ton of excitement. They're a great fan base. Their fan base has always been almost always been better than their team. Great energy there at Death Valley on a Saturday night. If you've never been to an away game there, go to an away game there. But you look at Orgeron, not successful at Ole Miss at all, not successful at USC, even with all the resources there, and has shown no hints of being an elite head coach at LSU. LSU is a school that deserves an elite head coach. Let's just be honest about it. Like you said, they start off with Miami. Look, they've got talent at LSU, but can they put it all together? The last 5 or 6 years, the thing that brought Les Miles down was he couldn't find a quarterback. It was like a Shakespearean play, a quarterback, my kingdom for a quarterback. That now they've got Joe Burrow from Ohio State. I guess he's going to beat out the kid, Miles Brennan. We'll see how that goes. But again, he's a guy that had to transfer from Ohio State because he couldn't win the job there. So we'll see how that goes. They start off with Miami. They have to travel to Auburn. They have to travel to Florida. They get Georgia at home, but Georgia's clearly a better team. They get Mississippi State at home. That's going to be a big game. We'll know after October 20th. I mean, LSU could very easily be 4-3 or 3-4 going into that Georgia game. So I got LSU at 6-6. I just don't see where they're getting 7-8 wins. I don't see on paper why people have them in the top 25. I'd be happy to listen to you or an LSU fan tell me why they're going to win 8 or 9 games, why they're a top 25 team. I just don't see it.
I've got 4-4 in the SEC. I think the Miami game is winnable, but I'll give them a 60-40 Miami on the plus side shot of defeating the Canes. I have yet to make a selection. I have promised the Mark Rogers TV viewership Wednesday pick, so I guess I'm going to be doing that awfully late tonight, or maybe tomorrow. I'll buck the rule the first week of getting those selections done. But Miami LSU, looking forward to that one. I think it's going to be a good game. Yeah, it's a really difficult schedule when you draw Florida and Georgia from the other division, and you got to play in the best top to bottom division in college football. So I've got 7-5 and 4-4. The odd thing about the Orgeron hire, and a lot of LSU people would correct me, I would think to an extent, because I don't want to. It's a bit of a general statement that I make, but it seems as though they basically replaced Les Miles with Les Miles. They took a coach who has all the qualities that you outlined, and they pretty much hired the same guy in regards to this guy wins over the room. The players like him. He's a good guy. He's a solid guy. He can turn a phrase, or he's got kind of a quirky way about him that people like. He'll be able to recruit because he can go into a living room and talk a homespun style with the family and the mom in particular. And he'll keep the recruiting ranking there in the top 10 or 12 in the nation. But man, when it comes to matching up with the likes of Nick Saban and his staff on game day and preparing for maybe a bowl game or a college football playoff game, hopefully someday, against the likes of a number of staffs across the country, I don't put a whole lot of faith in Ed Orgeron, just like I did in Les Miles when they were good enough to go to Tuscaloosa and eke out a 9-6 overtime win. But when Nick Saban had 6 weeks to prepare and Les Miles had 6 weeks to prepare, Les Miles couldn't get the ball past the 50-yard line. Les Miles wasn't a game management, time management coach. He made stupid decisions in the clutch. Ed Orgeron, I don't have a list to run down like I did with Les Miles. I had a ready-made mental list of snafus in big games, but with Ed Orgeron, it just seems as though they replaced Les Miles with another Les Miles.
Except for one thing, Les Miles has won a national championship. Les Miles has won an SEC championship. Ed Orgeron's never won anything. 3 stops: Ole Miss, USC, and LSU. It just hasn't won anything. I got it. Les Miles probably did less with more than any coach in SEC history. I mean, some of those teams that he had at LSU were literally NFL rosters that had 20 guys who would eventually play in the NFL, and he won, I think, 1 national championship, and that was really with Nick Saban's guys. And you're right, he messed up the clock often, but he hasn't won a national championship. He is, I mean, Ed Orgeron hasn't won anything. Ed Orgeron hasn't won a division title. I just don't see it. Their best player, Greedy Williams, is a cornerback, so you can isolate. You can just not run to that side. You can not throw to that side of the field. Their best player on offense is probably their tight end, Foster Moreau. So he is a great player. He's a great tight end. I'm really excited to watch him play this year. One of those special two-way tight ends that can block and catch the ball. So again, when your best player on defense is a cornerback that you can throw away from on every play, and your best player on offense is a tight end, I mean, maybe LSU surprises me. I don't know. I just don't see 8 wins there. I just don't.
They did bring in Jonathan Giles from Texas Tech, 69 catches, 13 touchdowns, 1,100 yards.
You got to throw it to him. You got to throw it to him. LSU hasn't had a quarterback in several years now. That was the downfall of Les Miles. They lost to Troy last year.
Yeah, so I bring up Giles just to say that they've got experienced productivity there that they don't have elsewhere. So Terrace Marshall was a 5-star best wide receiver in the nation that they're bringing in, and maybe he gets some time. And Jamar Chase and Keenan Jones, they brought in 3, 4, or 5-star wide receivers. Maybe those guys get pressed into duty. Maybe Ed Orgeron's not going to be around to coach them, and maybe they're going to be very competitive in the SEC West with a better coach on the sidelines in a few years. Dave Aranda does a tremendous job and has a great track record in his stops there. LSU, yeah, should be interesting. This will be the best. I've got them at 7-5. I'm only 1 rung higher than you, but I got to think they're the best 7-5 roster in the nation.
And again, so you got Steve Ensminger as the offensive coordinator. I mean, if you're Ed Orgeron and you're on your 3rd stop, I mean, surely you're not going to get hired after this. This has got to be the end of the line. Wouldn't you go out and wouldn't you say to the athletic director, hey, you know what? I only need $1.5 million. Give me $1 million or $1.5 million so I can go hire an offensive coordinator, a top level offensive coordinator with all this talent, all these stars that I'm juggling here. They're just falling out of my hands. I can give that to somebody who can turn that into a productive offense. Wouldn't you say that? Again, the Dooley hire baffles me. The Steve Ensminger, I just don't see why Ed Orgeron wouldn't go out and get somebody with maybe a little bit more proven track record. LSU is a great place to coach. If you're a coach there, you can do what you want. You're not going to get critiqued. You're not going to really get looked into by the administration or anything. You can pretty much kind of go do what you want. I just don't see why he wouldn't go out and get a top level guy who he could give the keys to that offense to and put points on the board and get LSU back to where they deserve to be.
Insminger ran the offense down the stretch in 2016. If he was that good doing it, I don't know why they went out and got Matt Canada, who obviously didn't get along with Ogeron, and it never worked out.
Who's now an interim head coach, I believe, at Maryland.
Yes.
Yes,
he is.
Kind of worked out for him.
Dealing with that situation.
Yep.
Mike LaBall from Last Word on College Football joining me for our big SEC season preview here at Mark Rogers TV, with the conference and the rest of college football cranking up starting tomorrow night. The big games for this weekend with Alabama, Louisville, Auburn, Washington, LSU, Miami in particular. And we had an earlier chat concerning the SEC. And so we are concerning the Auburn Tigers as we get down to our final two of Auburn, Alabama. So unless you've got any more thoughts about the Tigers, and I'll let the people watching now and watching later on tape that if you want to hear the Auburn conversation, it was at the beginning of the show. So we have made our way all the way through to the gold standard of not just the SEC, but college football with 5 national championships in the past 9 years, the Alabama Crimson Tide. Mike, I guess the only thing to talk about is whether there's a case that they don't win the division.
Normally, if I look at a team on paper and they have 2 quarterbacks and they can't make up their mind which quarterback's going to play, and they have 3 returning starters on defense, that raises red flags for me. I'm a big fan of experience. Alabama lost 8 guys to the NFL draft last year on one side of the ball. 8 defensive players drafted to the NFL. Look, if you look at Alabama on paper, who's going to be their quarterback, who's going to fill in all those spots on defense, there's a lot of questions. Alabama is the one team in the nation where I don't care what the questions are until they lose, until they don't win the division, not win it or not win a national championship, one of the two. I'm just going to pencil them in as the division winner. A couple years ago, I bought into the whole thing where Georgia might beat them this year. This might be the end of the Alabama dynasty, and I got burned. So you know what? I'm picking them to win the SEC West until they don't, or they don't win a national championship, one of the two. They were tied for the division winner last year. A lot of people say Auburn. They didn't win the division. They were actually tied for division winners. Auburn went to the SEC championship game on the tiebreaker. But a lot of question marks in Alabama, but I don't care about the question marks until Nick Saban proves to me that he can't win. I'm just going to continue to pick Alabama. He has everything a coach dreams of. He has a system in place, a program in place that continually replenishes itself. Look, I'm a Tennessee guy. You can not like Alabama all you want. You can have 40 years of dislike for Alabama. You can dislike Nick Saban all you want, but what the guy has done, you have to recognize that what the guy has done there is absolutely amazing. It's probably the greatest coaching job that we've seen in college football. He's just built a program that continues to churn out success with different players in this era of the third year to the NFL draft and 85 scholarship limits and 126 teams who are competitive across the highest level of college football. He's done it in this era. It has to be recognized for the greatness that it is. So until Alabama loses, I'm penciling him in as number 1 in the SEC West.
So Saban won his first national championship there in 2009, and that was a narrative that I heard over and over as they started to churn out these NFL players on both sides of the ball, but especially defense, that, okay, well, Alabama's going to take a step back because they just lost 8 NFL players or whatever it was that particular year. Now, I think we've seen the repetition of the replenishing of talent, as Mike puts it, time and time again, to where it's got to be proven to me that Alabama's going to get knocked off by somebody, and I just don't see the team in their division that can do it. I see some really good talent at Auburn in particular, Mississippi State to a lesser extent, and LSU, of course. They're a big wild card, but not the proven talent in place. And what Nick Saban has done is, I believe, is the greatest coaching job in the history of college football. And there have been a couple opportunities, one being last year, that I don't believe that his team should have been given the opportunity to play in the college football playoff. But to its credit, they went out and they defeated 2 of the best teams in the nation back-to-back in Clemson and Georgia. And when receiving the opportunity, they have always seized it. And when they didn't quite seize it, let's say against Clemson in 16 and Ohio State in 14, it's not like they were ever embarrassed in any way, shape, or form. It was always nail biter fashion that somebody kick six Ohio State with an all-time NFL roster kind of team, or Georgia, or I'm sorry, Clemson, Deshaun Watson being basically Superman. It's taken those kind of Herculean efforts to knock them off the top.
I'm going back through their last 5 seasons, and their last 5 seasons. Help me out here with the loss to Ohio State in the CFP in 14.
Sure. What are you looking for? A score?
Yeah, what was the score?
42-35.
So 7 points. They've lost 2, 4, 5, 6, 7 games in the last 5 years. 1 by 12 points, 1 by 7 points, and 3 by 6 points. I'm missing the postseason result in 2013.
2013, they lost to Oklahoma in the Sugar Bowl. We were all shocked. That was after the kick six. Oklahoma came out and smoked them.
Yeah. So minus that game. So the consistency. Here's one thing I find interesting about the Saban era at Alabama. For the great as it has been, I think he only has 1 undefeated season. This constant churning of 13-1, 13-1, 14-1, 14-1, 12-2, 11-2 with championships. He just constantly churns out the 13-1, the 14-1s. It's kind of odd because in college football normally you see like a 13-0, 11-2, 13-0, 10-3. But his sinusoidal wave is just so, it's almost flat. It's 13-1 with a championship it's really amazing what he's done there.
It is certainly amazing, and the schedule doesn't help out the field. The schedule's not good. It's not difficult. It's Louisville's a good team, but they're not ready to challenge Alabama. None of us believe that, I don't think.
But again, we go back to schedule. I mean, when that game was scheduled, that's a program on the rise. They're a top ACC team. I mean, Alabama. Look, you can talk about the cream puff schedule in the SEC if you want, but Alabama every year starts out with a tough game. Louisville, Florida State last year, USC the year before that, Wisconsin, West Virginia, Virginia Tech. I mean, those are all top teams.
You're about halfway there, Mike. If you're Alabama, if you're Ohio State, if you're now Clemson, I expect you to go out and schedule another one of the behemoths or something close to it that we don't know what Ohio State's going to be in 5 years or Clemson's going to be in 5 years, but we're that close to knowing that they're going to be great. Louisville, we don't know what they're going to be. They're going to be a top 25-ish kind of team. It's a respectable game. Now, if Alabama did what other schools do, like a USC in particular, but there's a number of them now that go out and schedule 2 Power Fives, absolutely. Schedule Louisville, and you know what? Schedule Oklahoma as well.
Okay. Look. If an SEC team or if an Alabama team loses a couple games, then I look.
Florida had to play Florida State and Michigan last year. Georgia had to play Notre Dame and Georgia Tech. They played 2. Why can't Alabama do that? Auburn's got just the Washington game. Okay.
Well, Florida State and Georgia Tech are in-state rivalries.
Exactly, but then they went out and scheduled another
because they
Michigan or Notre Dame.
Because they have to. Alabama doesn't have to.
Well, of course they don't have to. They don't have to schedule anyone.
Well, they have to schedule 12 teams.
Yeah, they can go out and schedule another FCS school or whomever, Colorado State or somebody. I just don't. They're playing Duke next year. What?
Look, 3 of the most successful teams of the past 20 years. 10 years. Wisconsin, USC, Florida State.
Absolutely, those 3.
Alabama has played those 3 teams the last 3 years. They have won those games by a combined score of, let me do a little quick math, 76, 114 to 30.
Tremendous.
They beat 3 of the best teams of the last 10 years. They beat them 114, I believe, to 30. I mean, what more do you want from Alabama? Do you want them to play a P5 team every week?
Team.
They have scheduled. They played Florida State first game last year. They played USC.
Fine. Don't tell me West Virginia. I don't want them playing West Virginia unless it's a second game of the 4 that they get to schedule.
Virginia Tech the year before that.
No, it needs to always be Oklahoma, Ohio State, USC, Wisconsin's fine, Penn State, Michigan.
If they scheduled Virginia Tech in 2013, that means they scheduled them 2008, 29, 2010. That's back right in the era, the Frank Beamer successful years. I mean, you can't. I just look. I'm not an Alabama guy either. I'm a Tennessee guy, for God's sakes.
Duke next year. That's their big non-conference game.
Okay, so 1 year out of 10, they play a weak schedule.
And Louisville.
Again, they scheduled Louisville when Louisville was one of the top teams in the ACC. I don't know what to tell you, Mark. What more do you want from this team? They win 13, 14 games every year. It doesn't matter who they
play. I give them
play.
all the credit in the world. I just called Nick Saban the greatest coach in the history of the game. I'm just wanting them to schedule
over the last 3 years. They've obliterated three of the top 15 easily winningest teams of the last decade: Wisconsin, USC, and Florida State. Probably 3 of the 10 winningest teams. Obliterated them 114-30.
The USC game was 52-6. The other 2 games were competitive. They weren't nail biters, but they were competitive games.
35-17 to 24-7. So 59-24. They more than doubled them.
You have to watch the games, and I'm sure you did at the time, and I did as well. The Wisconsin game was a game into the 4th quarter. But regardless, yes, they were much better than those teams, and they took care of business, and they scheduled 3 really good teams. But, man, West Virginia and Louisville and Duke, that's your best game?
The West Virginia game was the closest of the 5 previous seasons.
I know, but that West Virginia team wasn't that good.
I don't know what West Virginia did in 2014. I'd have to go back and look at that.
I guarantee you that they weren't that good. They were okay.
Find out real quick.
They're West Virginia. 2014. I'm not coming up with that season off the top of my head. They went 8-5 or 7-6.
2014, they went 7-6.
There you go. They lost to number by 10 points, and they went 7-6.
They lost to number 2 Alabama, number 4 Oklahoma, number 10 TCU, number 12 Kansas State, and then they tripped up against Texas.
And they lost a bowl game.
The bowl game.
Arizona State. That the year?
Texas A&M.
Texas A&M, West Virginia. Oh yeah, like Liberty Bowl,
15.
Music City Bowl,
Liberty Bowl. Let's not confuse Memphis and Nashville ever again, Mark.
Okay.
So I mean, that 7-6 is 7-6. I got it, but they lost to the number 2, the number 4, the number 10, and the number 12 team. That West Virginia was not that bad. They had 4 losses to teams ranked in the top 12 in the nation.
All I'm saying is Alabama gets 4 non-conference games. They could do something similar to other teams in the nation, and 4 of them are in their own conference that actually typically, not every year, but go out and schedule a second difficult game. And so Florida has had to deal with Florida State and Michigan, for example, in the same year.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying.
If they were playing Penn State this year, absolutely fine. Play 3 nobodies. And
I understand what you're saying, but let's be clear. Florida doesn't do that every year. So the year before, their big out of conference was Massachusetts and North Texas. The year before that was New Mexico State and East Carolina.
But they've got Florida State, one of the perennial powers in college football, not Louisville or Duke.
Yeah, but you're using Florida as the example of what Alabama should do. And I understand what you're saying. I got it, but I don't know what more you want from Alabama. They're not going to schedule a P5 team.
More difficult.
The past 4 years, Louisville, Florida State, USC, and Wisconsin. What more do you want from that team?
Pitt this year is playing a Penn State, Notre Dame, and Central Florida out of conference. Pitt.
Okay. Good for them. Or if they win those 3 games, then put them in the CFP. But they're going to get crushed by all 3 teams.
Yeah. I would love for Alabama to play Notre Dame, Penn State, and Central Florida. And you know what? Most of the time they beat all 3 of them. But that would be tremendous if they went out and actually played that kind of schedule, especially when they get a gimme when Tennessee's down and then they get
come on.
The games.
You couldn't have used another team.
Well, I'm just using as an
What about
example.
Arkansas? Couldn't you use Arkansas?
They've got to play against Tennessee, and then it comes up the other years.
You were just telling me about how Butch Jones had brought Tennessee back to relevance
for 2 years,
20 minutes ago. The two 9-win seasons.
Fine, Alabama beat 2 good Tennessee teams in the last 10 years.
What? No.
Yeah.
Okay.
And one was a close game. The other was a blowout, if I remember correctly. The one in Tuscaloosa was close.
Yeah.
Very close.
Very close. Yeah, but again, I just don't know what you. Well, I don't. I mean, but then Alabama has. This goes back to the SEC thing. I know non-SEC fans are going to hate this, but Alabama also plays Mississippi State, LSU, Auburn, week in, week out, Texas A&M. So yeah, I got it. But I don't know. I mean, if everybody else in college football did it, then that's fine. You would expect Alabama to do it, but I just don't see that I don't see that their schedule is soft like your like the narrative you're spinning here.
I'm going to send you the schedule of about 15 other teams, non-conference schedules from this year that are extremely difficult.
Okay. Or are you going to send me their conference schedules too?
They can't control the conference schedule. They can control the non-conference schedule.
Okay, wow.
Which they shouldn't be able to. But anyway,
the reason they're allowed to control the non-conference schedule is because they can't control the conference schedule.
Yeah. That's Mike Laval from Last Word on College Football. We have wrapped our SEC preview special. I've got the Pac-12 and Tony Siracusa, a guy that Mike is very familiar with from Last Word on College Football, coming up with the Pac-12. And before we shut this down, Mike, we didn't even officially give our selections, so hopefully we kind of weaved through the records of these teams. But give me your championship game.
I've got Georgia, Alabama. I'm pretty. Georgia is not going to take a step back. I think they're the leaders of the East. There's a couple good teams in the West. Alabama, like I just said, they tend to trip up at least once a year. I'm not saying Alabama's a shoo-in in the West, but until they take a discernible step back, I'm not going to go against Alabama. They've proven themselves over the last 10 years that they're just the standard bearer in college football.
All right, I've got Georgia and Alabama. I would like to be more creative than that, but it's just difficult for me to find a path for anyone else. I've got Alabama going undefeated, Georgia with 1 loss in the regular season, and then Georgia pulling off an upset against Alabama. And you know what that means for the SEC.
2 teams in the
college football playoff.
2 teams in the playoffs again.
I don't want to see that, but I've got to pick it the way I see it. All right, from Mike Laval from Last Word on College Football, Mark Rogers, MarkRogersTV. Please join us on a regular basis here and also at Last Word on College Football for your needs throughout the season. Mike, I appreciate it.
Always a pleasure, Mark.